of Third Stage Consulting. We are an independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. And one of the questions we get asked very often is, how long is my ERP implementation going to take, and how much is it going to cost me? And there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. You get a lot of biases in the industry if you ask a sales rep who's trying to sell you software and perhaps isn't incentivized to paint a complete picture of the total cost of ownership or to account for some of those hidden costs of ERP implementations. You have consultants who might be advising you through the software selection process and don't really have the experience, the hands-on experience of guiding companies through those implementations. So there's a lot of bias and statistical noise, I guess you could say, in the industry in terms of understanding what the real story is as it relates to ERP implementation time and cost. And so we as a company at Third Stage do a survey and a study of hundreds of ERP implementations across the globe each year. We conduct this study. And our goal here is to look at the down and dirty details of what is actually happening in the marketplace. We're not trying to sugarcoat anything or give you a biased answer of what ERP implementation time and cost might look like. But we are here in the study and in this research here to help define what the average company experiences in terms of their ERP implementation time and cost. And if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, you can actually download this entire report in the link that you'll see in the description of this video on YouTube. And there's a lot of other information you'll see in that report that we won't cover here in this video beyond implementation time and cost. We cover things like operational disruption and risk, and some of the top challenges that people experience, what the top correlations and drivers of ERP implementation time, cost, and risk might be, all those sorts of things we look at in the study. And so as it relates to the topic at hand here, how long does it take and how much is it going to cost for us to implement our ERP implementation? And so as of 2019, which is when we published this report, we found that if you segment companies into two buckets, one being the mid-sized companies that are in that $50 million to $1 billion US in annual revenue, and you've got the larger companies that are $1 billion plus, you've got two different segments and two very different answers as it relates to duration. So when we look at the mid-sized companies, the average duration for the total transformation is just under a year and a half, between 14 and 16 months. And this number is actually pretty statistically stable over the years. When we've looked at this data over the last dozen or so years, we've found that that number really hasn't shifted that much. And so the other part of this too is you see a range there. We didn't give an exact number because averages don't really tell a good story as far as differences that might result from complexity and number of locations and just general industry and things of that nature. So what we do instead is look at what range captures a majority of organizations in that company size, in that mid-market. So in other words, most organizations in the 50 million to 1 billion in revenue are going to complete their ERP transformation in somewhere between 14 to 16 months. Obviously, if you're closer to $1 billion in revenue and you're more complex, you're more global, you're going to see a higher implementation duration potentially than that 16 months. And if you're a $50 million company that's a pretty vanilla organization with a single location, for example, you might be able to implement in less time. But overall, if you look at a majority of implementations that happen with mid-sized companies, they're going to fall within 14 to 16 months. And for large organizations that are over $1 billion, they're more likely to have multiple locations, multiple countries, diverse operations, diverse product lines, diverse customers, and all the things that really drive up your implementation time and duration. So they, or a majority of them, over $1 billion in US dollars, are going to experience implementations that range between 31 and 34 months. So just under 3 years for the larger multi-billion-dollar companies. And certainly if you're a 20 or 30 or $50 billion company, you're probably going to spend more time on it. We have one client in particular that their revenue is over $20 billion in revenue, and their overall implementation, I think, is somewhere between 7 and 8 years that they're in the middle of. So it could take longer if you're a larger, more complex organization. It could take you less if you're a simpler organization. Now, when we look at total cost, the interesting thing here is we can always look at dollars, but dollars don't really tell us a normalized story of what to expect as it relates to your total cost. So if you're a mid-sized company under $1 billion, chances are you have a high likelihood of spending somewhere between 3 and 5% of your annual revenue on your total cost of ownership. Now, just to caveat that, total cost of ownership includes not just software licenses or your subscription fees if you're in a cloud situation, but it also includes your implementation costs from your consultant, any hardware upgrades you might have to do, if there's any third-party bolt-ons that you need to add to the implementation. All those things are included, and it also includes internal labor too. So if you're backfilling your team, that adds to the cost as well. And when you're looking at companies that are over $1 billion, companies will spend on average between 2 and 3% of their annual revenue on the overall implementation. And the reason that percentage is lower when expressed as a percentage of annual revenue is because larger companies have more scale. There's a certain amount of time and money you're going to spend on your implementation no matter how big you are. But when you're a larger organization, you can scale those minimum costs over larger scale in terms of more dollars in your revenue, the denominator, I guess you would say, of the calculation. So that's why the number is lower. It's not that billion-dollar plus companies are better at managing spending or have some kind of competitive advantage over the mid-sized companies when it comes to this. It's just that they have more scale and they can spread those costs over a larger base. And so majority fall between 2 and 3%. One last thing I'll say on the total cost is that when we look at total cost of ownership and the percentages we have here, those numbers are obviously spread over the amount of the duration. So for example, let's say you're $1 billion company and you're going to spend $20 million on your implementation, total cost of ownership all in with internal labor and all that other stuff. You're not going to spend that in year one. Obviously, that's going to be spread out over 3 years or however long it takes you to implement. So it's not a recurring annual cost. It's just your total cost of ownership expressed as your annual revenue spread out over the total duration of the implementation. So hopefully this helps. I hope this gives you at least some high-level benchmarks to think through. Hopefully it's something that gives you a dose of reality, an unbiased view of what ERP implementation time and cost typically looks like. Obviously, as I mentioned before, these are averages. Most companies fall in these ranges. Doesn't mean it's going to apply to you in that same way, but hopefully at least gives you some kind of order of magnitude to work from. So again, my name is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting. I want to thank you for your participation here today. I hope this is helpful and look forward to chatting with you all soon. Take care.